Time to meet the men from the ministry.
And as you recognise there, it's Wilfred Hyde-White and Richard Murdoch. They're not the gentlemen we're going to be talking about today. The likes of some of these characters, General Sir Frederick Smith, General Sir Charles Passley, Colonel George Wynne, and Colonel William Yolland, FRS, from the Board of Trade. And some of the characters that we shall meet from the Northeastern include George Lehman, Alexander Christensen, Thomas Harrison, and George Gibb, who Ian kindly mentioned as an inveterate USA traveller. I think we might see him in a slightly different light today, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Just a little bit of background. This is based on surviving reports and correspondence that went from the Board of Trade to the Ministry of Transport and then ended up at the National Archives in Kew. And to give you an idea of the size of the material in the archive, there are over 1,600 inspection reports that just cover the Northeastern and its predecessors. These range from literally a single sheet of paper to others which have hundreds of pages, detailed drawings, statistics, all sorts of information. There are also many hundreds of reports on accident investigations, and these range from fairly simple injuries to employees right up to the major accidents on the Northeast that I think most of us are familiar with. And the period covered is from 1840 to 1922, obviously, the end of the Northeastern, and the reports and correspondence do continue from then, but today we shall just look at the Northeastern. Now, again, a little bit of background. The 1840 Regulation of Railways Act empowered the Board of Trade to appoint persons to inspect railways. Now, what that meant was that they could investigate accidents. In fact, the first accident to be investigated was at Howden on the Hull and Selby Railway, when a casting fell off a wagon and derailed the train. And then in 1842, it was realised that the 1840 Act didn't really cover the railways to the extent that the Board of Trade and the government wanted. And this gave the Board of Trade power to postpone the opening of a new line if they didn't think it was safe. But for existing lines, they could only use their powers of persuasion. And it's these powers of persuasion that we'll come across in a little while and see how well or badly they went down in the Northeastern. And from around 1854, up until then, the Board of Trade had been very secretive. Reports on accidents and reports on, or the investigations and reports on new railways were not made public, and if the press asked for them, they were refused. But the Board of Trade began to realise that part of the powers of persuasion could be, if you get some good publicity, name and shame, then this would perhaps encourage the railway companies to toe the line. So this is what they began to do. But it really wasn't until the 1889 Regulation of Railways Act, as a result of the Armagh accident in Northern Ireland, that the Board of Trade actually got the powers to compel railways to adopt safety standards like automatic brakes, interlocking, and the block telegraph system. But even despite these powers, the Board of Trade, the Railway Department and its inspectors still had to place great reliance on the development of this good working relationship with the railway companies and obviously with their local management. And it's this that I want to explore a little bit more today. Let's look at a very early inspection report, first of all. This is the Norton Curve in 1842. And those of you who know Norton will realise that the curve today from the south to the east runs here. The original one was on a much tighter radius and was built to avoid having to reverse trains coming from Hartlepool up at Norton West and then back down into the Clarence railway station, which even the Clarence and the West Hartlepool Railway and Dock Company realised was probably not the ideal thing to do. So anyway, General Passley came to inspect this, and this is an early example of a debate about a level crossing, because although you can see here, and as we know today, there is a bridge here where the main road crosses the railway, there wasn't in 1842. There was a level crossing. This is the route of the road here. There was a level crossing almost on the junction. So 4 lines going across the road. And there is a long inspection report and discussion about whether a level crossing should be allowed or whether a bridge should be built. And the Board of Trade could have said, we are not going to sanction opening of the curve unless you build a bridge. But General Passley had this long report, and he decided that if the crossing were watched by an active gatekeeper, I presume that means somebody who wasn't disabled or actually sort of got out and looked at things rather than sat in his hut. And he said it's not so particularly dangerous as to require the substitution of a bridge. He felt that the trains would only be moving slowly. They were going to be stopping, if I just go back one, they were going to be stopping here. There was a station here as well. Oh. And the station building had previously been a pub. And Passley remarks on this, that they are busy converting this building into a station at the crossing. And as the trains will be stopping, then they won't be going very fast over the crossing. So he didn't really think that it was going to be too dangerous. And yeah, one presumes they found an active gatekeeper. But of course, when the North Eastern built the curve on a much gentler radius in 1870, that was when the bridge was built and the crossing was abolished, and the layout that we know today was substituted. In these reports, there are a lot of little details that are quite fascinating today. And Passley said, after inspecting the curve at Norton, I took the Hartlepool and Dock Railway to Haswell, where I changed and descended to Sunderland by the Dereham and Sunderland inclined plane. So this was a ropework incline down from basically Seaton Bank. And he said, he wrote his report in the hotel in the evening, and he said, I shall be travelling on this tomorrow as well, and it will give me an opportunity to see whether rope-worked railways are equally safe as locomotive-worked railways. So quite, and it must have been quite a fascinating journey, really. Yeah. And I think the nice thing is that he covers it in his report. It's nothing to do with the Norton curve, but he thought it was something worth mentioning. So let's look at some powers of persuasion. And I'm a bit reluctant to mention this because Bill Fawcett's sitting in the front row. And as we know, Bill's written a superb book on Newcastle and Carlisle. I hope that we're not going to defame the Newcastle and Carlisle too much, but they submitted a timetable to the Board of Trade, and some clever chap worked out that they were obviously going faster than 20 miles an hour. So they wrote to Captain Laffan, this gentleman, who subsequently became the governor of Bermuda, would you believe? And there is a Governor Laffan's Fern. If you Google Laffan, that's what you find, first of all, Governor Laffan's Fern on Bermuda. Anyway, Laffan was somewhere down in the south, I forget where, I think Dorchester. Anyway, he wrote again from his hotel. He'd obviously been contacted. You do notice with all these things, the speed of the postal service. A letter written today will arrive the same day, or at the latest first thing tomorrow. So people would write and say, will you please come up by tomorrow's train? And they obviously expected the letter to be delivered. There's lots of examples of this. Anyhow, Laffan was asked to comment, and he said, well, I don't really think this is a good idea. He said they've got 23.5 miles of lightweight rail still. He didn't like the platforms. He didn't think they were adequate, whatever he meant by that. There were insufficient signals at the stations. That such stations as had signals had just an ordinary disc signal. that stopped trains going both ways. And in some cases, they were hardly visible. He said they made occasional stops at other locations, not shown in the timetable. Well, I mean, if somebody, the local farmer wants some stuff dropping off, then why not? Seems quite a reasonable idea. But of course, you might run into another train. Then he said also there were bridge repairs in progress, and there were a lot of what he referred to as sharp curves. So he wasn't impressed, but the interesting thing is that Newcastle and Carlisle was built under its own Act of Parliament prior to the 1840 Regulation Act. So the Board of Trade really had no powers to force the company to change anything. But Latham's report concludes, I'm still of the opinion that a greater speed than 20 miles an hour on the Newcastle and Carlisle Railway in its present state would be attended with positive danger to the public. Oh. Now, Bill might comment on what actually happened then, because the report, that's the end of the report. And I imagine the Newcastle and Carlisle directors weren't too impressed with that. It might have encouraged them to, clean up their act, as the saying goes, but that was really all he could do. He could not say, you can't operate.
No. They certainly started providing station platforms because there was an almost total want of them, really, at that time. And I can't remember actually what they did about the speed. There would have been a temptation, actually, for them to say, well, that should be cheaper to run the trains a bit slower. Mm-hmm. They might have used that as an excuse, but normally the Newcastle and Carlisle felt that they were on the scene so early, and of course they were covered by the legislation, but they, a bit like Tom Harrison, they really knew better than the Board of Trade how railways should be run.
Of course, yes. Well, I mean, these are Royal Engineers officers, who are, gentlemen, obviously. They were all fairly courteous with one another. We'll see a couple of exceptions, but yes, generally, one tried to reach a gentleman's agreement. But yeah, we'll come on Thomas Harrison in a moment. Let's have a look at. There are plenty of people in the room, and I never know, is this Brotherton or Brotherton? Yeah. Or don't you mind?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter, right, very good. Brotherton Bridge, 1850 to 1852. As we know, a fascinating tubular bridge, Stevens the River Aire. Captain Wynne inspected the Nottingley branch in March 1850, but there was only a temporary bridge at Brotherton, so he said, well, we can't open the branch yet because there's just a wooden bridge over the river, but I'll come back when the bridge is ready. And by July 1851, it was complete, or at least the up tube was complete. And Wynne commented, he'd probably been taken out to a nice lunch and all the rest of it. He said the workmanship of the bridge appears to be carefully executed, and he said that use might be permitted. So of course, trains began to run over a single line over this single tube. Now, 2 months later, the down tube was ready, and so Wynne had it tested. And what he did was they arranged for him to have 5 engines, and curiously 2 wagons of coke. I'm not sure they presumably weren't the tenders, but he says it's quite clear, and he had it weighed, or at least he knew what it weighed. It weighed 207 tons, and they ran these onto the middle of the down tube. And he measured the deflection, probably with a theodolite, and it was 1 5/16 inches, which he considered to be acceptable. But there was a problem. Both tubes were only 10'3" wide at the bottom, and they were 9'3" wide at the top. And Great Northern trains crossing the bridge actually had to take their side lamps off before they could get across.
Yeah.
Now, Wynne had missed this when he was inspecting the up tube. And he said, the tight clearance was a source of danger to an unwary passenger. So if you stuck your head out, it was going to chop it off. Yeah. They were very close. Yeah. And he said, well, the tubes were standing, and this is interesting, they were standing on a temporary structure. So there obviously was a timber, some sort of timber staging that they had built the tubes on. And he said it would be cheaper to fix this width problem now rather than wait. And then presumably, have to rebuild some sort of temporary support structure. Now, unfortunately, I've got these on my list for Q, but I haven't yet looked at 2 other files at Q, which are the York North Midland file on this debacle with the width of the bridge, and there's a Great Northern file as well. Presumably the railways weren't too impressed, and presumably they weren't too impressed with their engineer, who was of course none other than Robert Stevenson. I'm not sure whether they asked for a second opinion or whether Wynne was maybe called away on something else, but in January 1852, Captain Galton came and had a look at the bridge, and he came to the same conclusion. And this must have obviously gone back to Stevenson, and Stevenson said, well, I tell you what, let's take some of the internal stiffening ribs out. To me, this doesn't seem awfully clever because the ribs are not there for decoration, for them to stiffen the tube. But that was what he suggested, but Galton wasn't having any of that. And he said, Captain Coddington, one of his colleagues, had inspected a railway in, I think it was at Bury, where there was a similar very narrow bridge. This is one of these lovely quotes. He says, even third-class passengers, who are generally inconsiderate to matters of personal risk, have not quite 18 inches between the columns and the sides of the carriages. So, of course, first-class passengers, you wouldn't want to expose them to risk, but even third-class passengers might be exposed. So, this probably wasn't a good idea. I'm not sure what Stevenson thought to that, but they finally came up with another modification. They would put a piece of boilerplate between the flanges on the top of each tube. Now this is Wynne's drawing that's in the report, and there you see the tube as it was, with the top section is not flat, it's slightly curved, with a flange in the middle. So what they did was they split this flange and inserted a 21.5-inch section of boilerplate with 2 additional flanges on it in the middle to move the sides out. Now, again, that sounds like a good idea, but I can't understand how it worked, because how do you keep the sides of the tube parallel? If you look, those I should have mentioned as well, look, they still cut the ribs away. Yeah. So we've now got a structure that is, in my engineering sense, is weakened by 2 sets of additional flanges and boilerplate that's had some of the ribs cut away inside. Captain Wynne came back to report in September 1852, and he states quite clearly that only the top of the tube was modified. Yeah. So I just don't understand how, if it was like that, and you put 21 inches at the top, it would go like that, or they move the bottom out as well somehow.
But your dimensions at the beginning, it was wider at the bottom than the top.
It was, that's true, yes. Yes, it was about a foot difference. So, I'm not sure. Anyway, Wynne obviously decided that this was satisfactory, and so he gave permission to open the bridge fully, and this took place in late November 1852. So the interesting thing about it is that he was not able to tell them to close the first tube that was completed, because he had given them permission to do it, and that was that. So he couldn't go on and say, oh, no, sorry, I didn't realize, you have to close them both. So they continued running. Presumably they did the one tube, widened that, moved the trains over, and then did the other one. But again, the legal position was that he could not stop traffic on the one that he'd already given permission for.
Wow.
So let's move on to Sunderland. And this is where, as we know, Thomas Harrison grew up in Sunderland. And in 1853, the York North Midland had completed their line from Penshaw down to Hendon here on the dockside, joining the Durham and Sunderland coming down from Merton and into the terminal station here. And this line coming out from Penshaw, from Fawcett Street as it later was, had a 1 in 50 gradient descending, and this one was descending at 1 in 300. We'll come to the disgruntled member of the public in a moment, but what they were doing was that there were up to 30 coal trains a day, says Wynne. There were up to 30 coal trains a day, and most of the coal trains had carriages on the back, which to me sounds like a tremendously intensive service, so maybe you got that wrong. But anyway, what they were doing was they were detaching the carriages from the coal train up here somewhere. Presumably the coal train then proceeded into the docks, and they gravitated the loaded passenger carriages down the line into the passenger shed. And of course, this is over a single line, and there were no proper signals anywhere near here. For the signalling book, we tried to look into this, but the signal box appears to have been a hut. I doubt whether it even had a point lever in it. I think it might have had a signal lever, but it seems unlikely. Anyhow, what happened was that Wynne went to have a look, but first of all, let's just have a peep at why Harrison hadn't replied. He'd had a letter from this chap, and the complaint came from somebody who the Durham Chronicle refers to as that pretty notorious person, Jerry Summers. He'd previously been jailed for bankruptcy, and he blamed that on the York, Newcastle and Berwick because they had provided him with coal stays on Sunderland Moor. And I presume there was a squabble about what he was owed or what the railway was owed for using these coal stays because he went bankrupt. And in his letter to the Board of Trade about Hendon Junction, he says, I won't go into the other injuries which the railway company has caused to me, but I would like to bring to your attention something which is extremely dangerous. And so Wynne set off again up to Sunderland and had a look at the site. And after a set of carriages went past him at about 30 or 40 miles an hour, he said, I've never in my experience met with anything to equal the danger that exists at this junction. So you know, it must have really caught his attention.
Jerry was right.
Yeah, so Jerry probably got one in there. We don't know what Harrison thought about this, but he probably, I'm sure he would know Summers. Summers was obviously a Sunderland character. He lived in Bishop Wearmouth. I'm sure that they would at least know of him if he didn't know him directly. And he probably thought, oh, there's that silly idiot Summers again. I'm not going to reply to that. But the Board of Trade had protested, and so the railway said, well, okay, Captain O'Brien, who at that time was working for the York, Newcastle and Berwick before joining the North Eastern, of course, in 1853, he said, well, we'll adopt the recommendations from Captain, from Wynne, and that was to double the single line section past the signal box and to install adequate signalling. So that presumably sorted things out. He doesn't mention whether they ought to have a locomotive at the head of the carriages. And the investigation report says nothing about that. So perhaps they did and perhaps they didn't. So we move on to 1870 and we go a little bit closer towards Newcastle. And again, this is something that most of you in the room will be familiar with, of course. Captain O'Brien, the general manager of the North Eastern, and the inspecting officer, Colonel Yolland. Now, as we've seen, generally they communicated in a civilized tone, and these things from Wynne saying, I've never seen anything as dangerous as this, they're relatively unusual. But this all changed in 1870 because these two characters locked horns. First of all, Colonel William Yolland, Fellow of the Royal Society, and later Chief Inspecting Officer at the Board of Trade, and Captain William O'Brien, the North Eastern General Manager. And as Bill mentioned earlier, the railway directors and the railway managers basically thought, we know how to run a railway. And these chaps from, you know, there might be Royal Engineers officers and all the rest of it, we know what the practicalities are, they don't. And there was a Royal Commission inquiring into railway accidents earlier in 1870, when both of these gentlemen gave evidence. Captain O'Brien, as those of you who've had the misfortune to read our signalling book will know, Captain O'Brien said, I do not think that just because the Board of Trade makes a suggestion that it is necessarily an improvement. Well, I don't suppose Yolland thought that was a particularly clever thing to say. I think basically he had it in for Captain O'Brien, as we would probably say today. Yolland was a determined advocate of the block system, but of course he had no powers to make anybody adopt it. O'Brien and Thomas Harrison were very sceptical of the system's value, and obviously they were reluctant to spend the shareholders' money on something which would cost a lot and would bring, as they saw it, negligible benefits. But in 1870, there was a series of serious accidents on the North Eastern, and of course they culminated in the fatal collision, head-on collision at Brockley Winds in December 1870. And Yolland, as I think we might say today, really launched into the North Eastern. In 2 consecutive reports, he wrote, first of all, I'm afraid he's of very little use for me towards the introduction of the absolute block system. As the general manager has told the committee of the House of Commons, this is this Royal Commission, that the block system is immature and that it is only experimental. And then it got worse, and he said nothing can more plainly exhibit the entire absence of responsibility that exists on the part of railway directors, their officers and servants. The entire absence of responsibility. This is going in the papers, guys. This is not good. And he says, it appears to me that the company's management is wholly to blame for this accident. And there's nothing in writing, but I could imagine that at that time, I don't think the North Eastern had a legal department. They used a York firm of lawyers, but they were being bombarded with claims. And as anybody knows in this room now, if I go along and say, my husband's just been killed in a railway accident, I want £10,000, the North Eastern would say, well, you know, it wasn't our fault. And they would say, well, just a minute, the government inspector says it was. And they ended up giving out, just for Brockley Winds, they spent over £36,000 on compensation claims. And I think this is probably the all-time low between in the relationship between the North Eastern and the Board of Trade. Captain O'Brien retired shortly after the reports were published. There have been various speculations that he was encouraged to retire, but I don't think he was, actually. It doesn't appear so. Although there are some rather mysterious things about his going. And of course, the North Eastern then proceeded to install the block system, but they spent about £360,000 over the next 9 years on doing that, so a huge amount of money. Let's move on a year. The Blythe and Tyne Railway. Some of the inspecting officers weren't quite as irascible as Yolland. Yolland had quite a tongue, and you know, I think he enjoyed it personally. I'd love to have met him. So there was an accident at Morpeth, and Colonel Hutchinson went up to Morpeth. And while he was investigating into the accident, he noticed the Blythe and Tyne had doubled their line into Morpeth Station, but they'd not submitted this for inspection. Well, this seemed a bit peculiar. And not only that, there were 5 single-line sections between Newsham and Morpeth, which the Blythe and Tyne had undertaken to work by train staff in 1858, but they weren't doing it. They were just using, I suppose, what today we call permissive block. In other words, you know, off you go. Watch out for anything in front. What they did with things coming the other way, I don't know. They probably had the electric telegraph, but it was all a little bit shaky. So the Blythe and Tyne, I think this is what I would have said as well. The Blythe and Tyne said, well, we didn't know that we had to submit it for re-inspection. Well, I should have known. They didn't, they sort of said, oh, you know, terribly sorry. And the files are silent on the working of the single lines, so I presume that the Blythe and Tyne went back to staff working, which is what they should have done. The interesting thing is, though, that this, I mean, this is a flagrant breach of the law. You know, you're not supposed to do this. But it was handled with great courtesy, and Hutchinson's reports, you know, my dear sirs, and all this sort of stuff, they don't have any of the fiery tone of Yolland. So I think Hutchinson was probably quite a different character. So, late 1870s, this is where they ended up having to get the chairman to write a letter. The Waterhouses branch had been built quite a lot earlier, but as a coal-carrying railway. And it was upgraded for passenger traffic, and in early 1877, Colonel Hutchinson took a look at it. Curiously enough, there was only one station at Waterhouses. There were no intermediate stations at this time. But the board said, well, we can't sanction opening because there's no turntable at Waterhouses, because they didn't want trains running tender first from the passenger carriages. It was basically not in their rules. The railway companies had been protesting about that, and it was the subject of negotiation between the Railway Companies Association, which was a sort of a lobbying body, not the same as the Railway Clearing House, and the Board of Trade, but it had not yet been resolved. So Sir Henry Calcraft, who was the secretary of the railway department and a top civil servant rather than one of the inspecting officers, he actually refused to sanction opening a further 6 times while this was sort of batted to and fro between the North Eastern and the Board of Trade. Of course, the North Eastern's, I presume, losing passenger revenue, and of course they're losing face with the local population because they've said, well, you know, we're ready to open the railway. The North Eastern had written to the Board of Trade and said, you know, the directors of the opinion that no questions relative to a turntable at Waterhouses Station properly arise. Well, the board wasn't having any of that. And they also said, well, we'll use a tank engine. And the Board of Trade said, yeah, well, we're not having any of that either. We still need a turntable. So they tried a compromise. It's starting to sound a bit like the Brexit negotiations. And they said, well, how about if the Board of Trade said, well, I'll tell you what, if you give us an undertaking to build a turntable when we think it's necessary, we'll let you open it. And the North Eastern said, no, we're not doing things like that. You know, no. So the Board of Trade said, well, you can wait. And they were getting nowhere, basically, after several months. So it came up at the board meeting, and George Lehman wrote to the president of the Board of Trade, and he said, we promise to comply with any new regulations should these be introduced. And this was obviously with an eye towards these discussions with the Association of Railway Companies. As we know, Lehman was the North Eastern chairman, and he was also the Liberal MP for York. And the president of the Board of Trade was a gentleman by the name of Sir Charles Adderley, who was the Conservative MP for North Staffordshire. If Adderley replied, then there's no copy in the files, so presumably that will be in a separate Board of Trade file, and sometimes they're very difficult to find. But most likely he just passed the letter on to the railway department and said, you know, what the devil's going on here, sort it out. But very fortunately, fortuitously perhaps, the rules had just been changed, and so Colonel Addison and Calcraft conferred and said, well, I think this just about falls within the new regulations, so I think we can probably sanction the opening, and we won't build a turntable and we'll allow them to use a tank engine. So after 6 months delay, passenger service to Waterhouses began on a rather curious date, Thursday, the 1st of November. And as most of you probably know, a turntable was never built at Waterhouses. Yeah. So 6 months delay for, which I'm sure caused a lot of frustration with the North Eastern. When Lehman wrote to Adderley, he enclosed a cutting from the Northern Echo, which was of a public meeting at Esh-Winning, called to protest about the delay in opening the railway, and saying that the working class population of the valley is looking forward to being able to be transported into Durham, and you know the railway had sent somebody, and they said it's not our fault, it's the Board of Trade's fault. So now we come to the last one of the series, and I've called this the Battle of Felling Cattle Dock. And this is where our friend Sir George Gibb appears, George Gibb as he was then. And the North Eastern, as you probably realise, was engaged in quadrupling the line, widening the line from Felling to Pelor in 1895. The rebuilt station at Felling would no longer have a horse and cattle dock. There'd be no room because they needed the space for the platforms and the extra running lines. And Felling Urban District Council approached the North Eastern, but they were interested, and they said, well, there's another dock at Park Lane. It's only 3/4 of a mile away. Well, Felling UDC weren't getting anywhere, so they had a bright idea. They said, we know what to do. We wrote right to the Board of Trade and asked if they can help. You know, the Board of Trade is something to do with railway, and they have sort of inspectors and this kind of stuff, so maybe they can help. So the Board of Trade got this letter and they sent it to the North Eastern and said, can you let us have any comments? Because the letter said we've approached the railway and they've told us no. So things now start to go pear-shaped, and they involve 2 individuals, and they're both lawyers, and they could easily have resolved matters amicably, but they didn't. First of all, is Francis Hopwood, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Railway Department of the Board of Trade, and as we shall see, someone who became quite a prominent civil servant, and George Gibb, who was the North Eastern General Manager. Neither of these gentlemen had been knighted at this stage. Gibb sent a short reply to the Board of Trade. And he said, as the Board of Trade have no jurisdiction in regard to the subject matter, my directors do not propose to submit observations upon the complaint. And that's more or less the entire letter. Hopwood put on in the margin of this letter another curt reply by Mr. Gibb to a communication from us. So he'd obviously had this sort of thing before. Now things start to escalate badly. Hopwood sent the UDC a copy of Gibb's note. And he also added a couple of points in the accompanying letter. He said, the Board of Trade is of the opinion that a local authority is entitled to courteous treatment from the railway company. And worse, he said, the inspecting officers would most carefully examine the accommodation provided when it is submitted for inspection. Well, this is threatening, you know. And he then sent Gibb a copy of his letter to the Urban District Council. So this is stirring it in modern parlance. Gibb was probably furious. I would imagine there were a few unprintable words in the General Manager's office here in York. At any rate, he showed the letter at the next board meeting, which was on the 14th of November. And in fact, the directors fairly reasonably shared Gibb's concern and said, well, you know, we can't have inspecting officers looking at whether there's a cattle dock or not. That's nothing to do with the Board of Trade. So a letter was written this time by the chairman. The chairman at this stage was Sir Joseph Pease, and the president of the Board of Trade was a gentleman called Charles Ritchie, who was from the Dundee Jute family. And this letter went on the 12th of December. It's getting close to Christmas. Pease made the following points. He said the key issue is the special instructions which it is proposed to give the inspecting officer. And he said quite rightly, this practically amounts to a claim that the control of the railway as regards accommodation to be provided is to be taken out of the hands of the directors. You know, so who's running the railways, the government or is it us? And he continued, whilst the directors are desirous of cooperating cordially, they cannot acquiesce in a course which would take them from the duty of determining the nature and extent of the accommodation to be provided by the company. I'm quite convinced that Hopwood had overstepped the mark when he said, well, I'll tell the inspector that you'll have to build the cattle dock, so watch it. And now it was Hopwood's turn. Of course, the letter has gone to his boss's boss. Now, you never really want this to happen. You know. Richie, no doubt, said, where is Felling? What's going on? You know, what's all this? You know, Sir Joseph Pease, he's an important industrialist in the North. He's written, what? So, Hopwood went home, at least he appears to have gone home, and he drafted a position paper. It runs to 1,200 pages. It's in part written on this domestic-headed note paper. He wrote in the corner, pressing, copying room, a typed copy as soon as possible. And you can see it there, pressing, copying room, a typed copy as soon as possible. And those are his initials, FSH. And he says, I am sorry that the chairman of the NER felt it necessary to write to the president with reference to our letter, and it goes on. But now, in this position paper, we start to see some of the background to Hopwood's frustration with Gibb. He says, the general manager has steadily set himself to oppose the policy of friendly intervention and conciliation. To the Board of Trade, he says, show me you can compel me by Act of Parliament and I will move. The Board of Trade had appointed a sub-inspector to look at the dreadful safety record in Hull. And Gibb wrote to them and said, may I remind you that the yards are private property. So he's basically saying, if you send an inspector, he can jolly well stand outside. He's not coming on our railway. You know, again, this is not, it may be legally true, but it's not necessarily the best way to get friendly cooperation. At Warcop, at the far end of the Eden Valley line, the loop was not signalled for crossing passenger trains, but the North Eastern was doing this. And the Board of Trade had criticised this, and Gibbs said, well, we can't afford to spend any money at Warcop, and if you insist, we'll close the station and we'll say it's the Board of Trade's fault. So, yeah, so Yabu sucks to you. And so you know, so they start batting it backwards and forwards. Hopwood drafts a reply to Pease for Ritchie to sign. And Ritchie sent this on the 23rd of December. And in the letter he said to Pease, would you please attempt to walk up yourself? And it ends, the Board of Trade and its officers are anxious to work in that spirit of harmony with the North Eastern Railway, which exists at the present time with other railway companies. So we can get on fine with them, it's just you guys. And things appear to have quietened down. There's nothing more in the files until August, when Gibb wrote to Hopwood, actually offering to show him the plans for felling. Aha. They appear to have met in August or September. Gibb brought a plan of the area, it's in the file, and a note saying how many numbers of cattle and horse wagons have been dealt with at felling in 1893 and 4. It's a handful. You know, it's 8 or 9 wagons in a year. And they seem to have buried the hatchet, which is probably just as well. And there's quite a pleasant handwritten note from Gibb asking for an appointment, and it's signed, yours very truly, George S. Gibb, to Mr. Hopwood. And at the bottom, he's also realised that Hopwood has by now had a CBE, so he puts a CB at the bottom, Mr. Francis Hopwood, CB, Railway Department, Board of Trade. And Hopwood then noted on, you know, there's a cover sheet with all these things at the Railway Department, and Hopwood wrote on the back of the cover sheet, this all shows that if Mr. Gibb had chosen to give us the facts at first, a great deal of trouble would have been saved. I think we should tell him so, and add that after considering the materials he has given us, we do not propose to press the company to supply them. So there was never a cattle dock at Felling. And I suspect that Gibb realised that, you know, it was better to have a conciliatory approach to them. Just as a footnote, Gibb was knighted in 1904, and of course he left the North East in 1906. Yeah. Hopwood was knighted in 1901, and he was created Baron Southborough in 1917. And he was involved in all kinds of stuff. He was a personal friend of Churchill and blah, blah, blah. And he was involved in the acquisition and cutting of the Cullinan diamond. And that's probably one of the reasons behind his knighthood, but he then became a peer of the realm. So, two quite interesting people, but as lawyers, they shouldn't have been fighting with one another. If they'd just cooperated at the start, then that would have been a whole lot better.